Raindrops hit the sidewalk like tiny bullets as David hurried down 5th Street, his worn sneakers splashing through puddles he didn't have time to avoid. The morning had already gone wrong in every possible way. His alarm clock had died sometime during the night, leaving him to wake up 30 minutes late. The coffee maker refused to work, and now the weather had turned nasty just as he stepped outside. David pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders and checked his phone again. 8:15. He was supposed to be at Morrison's grocery by 8:30, and the bus was nowhere in sight. If he was late again, Mr. Peterson might actually follow through on his threat to find someone more reliable. David couldn't afford to lose this job, not when rent was due next week and his nursing school textbooks had already maxed out his credit card. The downtown morning rush was in full swing. People in expensive suits and designer coats walked past him with purpose, most of them staring at their phones or talking into wireless earbuds. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to be, someone important to meet. David often wondered what it would feel like to walk with that kind of confidence, to know that missing a bus wouldn't mean choosing between groceries and electricity. As he turned the corner near Bella's coffee house, something caught his attention. An elderly man sat in a wheelchair near the entrance, clearly struggling with something. The man's face showed frustration as he repeatedly tried to move forward, but one of his wheels seemed stuck. Other people walked around him like he was a piece of street furniture, their eyes fixed on their destinations. David slowed his pace, watching the scene unfold. The old man appeared to be in his 70s, wearing a faded blue baseball cap and a simple gray jacket that had seen better days. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, gripped the wheel rims as he tried to force the chair to move. But something was clearly wrong with the mechanism. The practical part of David's brain reminded him about the time. The bus would arrive any minute, and he really couldn't afford to be late. But something deeper, something his grandmother had taught him years ago, wouldn't let him keep walking. She used to say that character wasn't about what you did when people were watching. It was about what you did when no one would ever know. David stopped walking and approached the elderly man. "Excuse me, sir. Are you having trouble with your wheelchair?" The man looked up, surprise evident in his kind brown eyes. "Oh, yes. The wheel seems to be stuck. I've been sitting here for 10 minutes trying to figure it out." His voice carried a slight accent. Maybe European, though David couldn't place it exactly. Without hesitation, David knelt down beside the wheelchair to examine the problem. The left wheel was indeed stuck, but not because of any major mechanical failure. It looked like the brake lever had somehow gotten jammed with debris and moisture from the rain. Small pieces of leaves and paper were wedged around the mechanism, hardened by water into a sticky mess. "I think I can fix this," David said, setting his backpack down on the wet sidewalk. He pulled out a few napkins he'd grabbed from the diner where he worked evenings and began carefully cleaning around the brake mechanism. The debris was stubborn, but with patience and gentle pressure, he managed to work most of it free. The elderly man watched with interest as David worked. "You know something about wheelchairs?" "A little," David replied, not looking up from his task. "I'm studying to be a nurse. We learn about mobility equipment in our program. Plus, my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, uses a wheelchair sometimes, and I've helped her with repairs before." After a few more minutes of careful cleaning and adjustment, David found the main problem. The brake lever had been pushed into an odd position, probably when someone bumped into the chair. He gently maneuvered it back to its proper place and tested the wheel. It rolled smoothly now. "There you go," David said, standing up and brushing the dirt off his knees. His jeans were now wet and stained, but the wheelchair was working perfectly. The brake lever just needed to be repositioned. "You should be good to go now." The elderly man tested the chair himself, rolling forward and back with ease. A genuine smile spread across his face. "Remarkable. I was starting to think I'd need to call for help." He looked up at David with what seemed like curiosity. "What's your name, young man?" "David. David Thompson." "Well, David Thompson, you've saved my morning." "I'm Robert." The man extended his hand and David shook it, noticing the firm grip despite Robert's age. "How can I thank you for this kindness?" David glanced at his phone. 8:22. The bus was definitely close now, but he didn't want to be rude. "No thanks needed, really. I'm just glad I could help." Robert studied David's face for a moment as if memorizing it. "At least let me buy you a coffee. You're soaking wet, and Bella's makes excellent hot chocolate, too." The offer was tempting, especially since David hadn't had time for breakfast. But being late to work again would create problems he couldn't afford. "That's really kind of you, but I'm already running late for work. I need to catch the next bus." Of course. Work is important." Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple white business card. "Here, take this anyway. If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." David accepted the card and glanced at it quickly. It was plain white with just a name, Robert Steinberg, and a phone number. No company name or title, which seemed a little unusual, but David didn't think much about it. He slipped the card into his wallet. "Thank you, Mr. Steinberg, and take care of yourself, okay? If that brake lever gives you trouble again, just remember it might need to be positioned straight up and down." "I'll remember that," Robert said, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. "And David, thank you for stopping. Host people." He gestured toward the busy sidewalk where pedestrians continued to rush past without a glance. Most people don't stop anymore. David felt a slight sadness at those words. Well, they should. Everyone deserves help when they need it. Just then, the familiar rumble of the city bus approached from down the street. David grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "That's my ride. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Steinberg." "Nice meeting you too, David. Have a good day at work." David jogged toward the bus stop, his wet shoes squelching with each step. As he climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, he could see Robert through the rain-streaked window. The elderly man was rolling his wheelchair toward the coffee shop entrance, moving easily now that the brake was fixed. As the bus pulled away from the curb, David settled back in his seat and tried to shake off some of the moisture from his jacket. His phone showed 8:28. He'd make it to work right on time, maybe even a minute early if traffic cooperated. The encounter with Robert had been brief, but something about it stuck with him during the ride. Maybe it was the man's genuine gratitude, or the sadness in his voice when he mentioned that most people don't stop to help anymore. Whatever it was, David felt good about his choice to help, even though it had cost him precious time. He pulled out his wallet to make sure Robert's business card was safe and dry. Just a simple card with a name and number. David wondered what kind of work Robert did, or if he was retired. The man had seemed well-spoken and intelligent despite his simple clothes. The bus turned onto Morrison Street and David could see the grocery store ahead. Time to focus on work and forget about chance encounters with strangers. After all, he'd probably never see Robert Steinberg again. 3 weeks had passed since David helped the elderly man with his wheelchair, and life had somehow gotten even more complicated. He sat at his tiny kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every day. The rent notice from his landlord lay on top, announcing a $50 increase starting next month. $50 might not sound like much to most people, but for David, it might as well have been $500. He rubbed his tired eyes and calculated the numbers again, hoping the math would somehow work out differently this time. Between his morning shifts at Morrison's Grocery and his evening job at Tony's Diner, he barely made enough to cover his current expenses. Add the rent increase, plus the nursing textbooks he still needed for next semester, and the numbers just didn't add up. David's phone buzzed with a text from his study partner, Kyle. "Hey man, you coming to study group tonight? We're reviewing for the pharmacology exam." David typed back quickly. "Can't make it. Working at the diner until midnight." The truth was, David had been missing a lot of study sessions lately, not because he didn't want to learn, but because every hour spent studying was an hour he wasn't earning money. His grades were still good, thankfully. He had always been a quick learner, and nursing came naturally to him. But he worried about falling behind when his classmates could afford to study full-time while he was juggling 2 jobs. The morning shift at Morrison's started at 8:30 sharp. David had gotten used to the routine by now. Stock shelves, help customers clean the produce section, repeat. It wasn't glamorous work, but Mr. Peterson was fair and the job was steady. That morning, as David arranged apples in perfect rows, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach a box of cereal on a high shelf. "Let me get that for you," David said, abandoning his apple display to help her. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Garcia, thanked him warmly. "You're so kind, dear. My grandson usually does my shopping, but he's away at college now." As David helped her load the heavy items into her cart, Mrs. Garcia mentioned that she lived alone in a house that was getting too big for her to manage. "I keep thinking I should move to one of those senior communities. But it's scary to leave the home where my husband and I raised our children. David found himself listening to her stories as they walked through the store together. She told him about her late husband, a veteran who had worked at the shipyard for 30 years. She spoke about her grandson's dreams of becoming a teacher and her worry about him taking on too much debt for his education. "You remind me of him," she said as David helped load her groceries into her car, always thinking of others first. That afternoon, David rushed from the grocery store to the community college for his afternoon classes. Advanced patient care was his favorite subject, even though the material was challenging. Professor Williams was discussing medication administration when David's stomach growled loudly enough for the people around him to notice. He'd skipped lunch again to save money and pick up an extra hour at work. After class, David walked to Tony's diner for his evening shift. The dinner rush was always intense, but he'd learned to handle multiple tables without getting flustered. The tips weren't great, but every dollar helped. That night, a family with 3 young children came in just before closing time. Most servers would have been annoyed, but David greeted them with genuine warmth. The youngest child, maybe 4 years old, had knocked over his juice cup almost immediately. While other customers might have gotten frustrated, David simply cleaned it up and brought a new cup with a lid. "Accidents happen," he told the worried parents. "No big deal at all." The father tried to tip extra for the trouble, but David politely refused. "You've got kids to take care of." "I know how expensive that can be." As the weeks continued, these small moments of kindness became routine for David. He helped an elderly man load his car with groceries during a rainstorm, getting soaked in the process. When a lost child wandered into the diner crying for her mother, David sat with her and kept her calm until the frantic parents arrived. At school, he spent his lunch breaks tutoring classmates who were struggling with anatomy and physiology, even though he could have used that time to study his own materials. One particularly difficult week, David's coworker at the diner called in sick for 3 straight days. The manager, Tony, was scrambling to cover the shifts. Without being asked, David volunteered to work doubles, even though it meant missing his pharmacology review session. His body was exhausted, but he knew Tony was in a bind, and the extra money would help with the upcoming rent payment. "You're a lifesaver, kid," Tony said, watching David handle a full section of tables during the dinner rush. Most people your age would have found an excuse to bail. But the extra hours came with a cost. David's textbook for advanced nursing practice sat unopened on his nightstand. The reading assignments were piling up, and he found himself falling asleep during lectures more often than he'd like to admit. His academic advisor, Dr. Martinez, had started asking questions about his absence from study groups and optional lab sessions. "Your test scores are still excellent," Dr. Martinez said during their monthly check-in, "but I can see you're stretched thin. Is everything okay at home?" David wanted to be honest, but he'd learned that talking about money problems usually made people uncomfortable. "Just trying to balance work and school," he said instead. "I'm managing fine." The truth was, David had started considering something that terrified him. Maybe he should drop out for a semester, work full-time, and save enough money to finish his degree without constantly struggling. He was only 1 semester away from graduation, but that semester was looking more impossible every day. One evening, as David walked home from his shift at the diner, he passed the bus stop where he'd helped the elderly man with the wheelchair. He remembered Robert Steinberg's kind eyes and the simple business card that was still tucked away in his wallet. For a moment, David wondered what kind of person Robert was, and whether their brief encounter had meant anything to the older man. David pulled out his phone and looked at his bank balance. After paying rent and buying the minimum groceries, he'd have exactly $12 left until his next paycheck. The nursing textbook he needed cost $180, and his professor had made it clear that it was essential for the upcoming semester. That night, David sat at his kitchen table again, surrounded by bills and college brochures for other schools that might be more affordable. The thought of quitting so close to graduation made his chest tight with disappointment. He'd worked so hard to get this far, survived so many challenges that would have stopped other people. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd told him years ago when he was struggling in high school. "Good people don't always get what they deserve right away," she had said. "But kindness has a way of coming back when you least expect it." David looked around his small apartment with its leaky faucet and the heater that only worked half the time. Tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all again, Stock shelves, attend classes, serve tables, study when he could. He'd keep helping people because that's who he was, not because he expected anything in return. Somewhere across town, though David didn't know it, an elderly man in an expensive penthouse was reading a detailed report about a young nursing student named David Thompson. Robert Steinberg set the papers down and smiled, remembering the kind young man who had stopped to help a stranger on a rainy morning. Even when he was clearly in a hurry, the investigation was complete, and Robert had made his decision. The 68th floor of the Steinberg Tower offered a view that most people only saw in movies. From his corner office, Robert Steinberg could watch the entire city spread out below him like a living map. Ships moved slowly through the harbor. Cars flowed through streets like streams of light. And somewhere down there, millions of people were living their daily lives, completely unaware that one of the richest men in the country was thinking about a young nursing student he'd met on a rainy sidewalk. Robert turned away from the window and looked at his assistant, Patricia, who had been with him for almost 15 years. She was one of the few people who knew about his occasional adventures in ordinary clothes, blending in with regular people to see how they really behaved when no cameras were rolling and no money was involved. "Patricia, I need you to help me with something," Robert said, settling into his leather chair. "Remember that young man I told you about? The one who helped me with the wheelchair?" Patricia looked up from her tablet where she'd been reviewing Robert's schedule for the week. "David Thompson, right? The nursing student who was late for work but stopped to help you anyway? That's the one. I want to know more about him." This wasn't unusual. Over the years, Robert had encountered many people during his informal investigations of human nature. Most were disappointing. People who acted one way when they thought someone important was watching, and completely differently when they believed no one would ever know. But David had been different. There was something authentic about his kindness, something that had stayed with Robert for weeks. Patricia nodded and made a note. "What kind of information are you looking for?" "Everything that matters. His background, his character, his struggles. But I want it done carefully and respectfully. No invasion of privacy. No digging through personal communications. Just the kind of information that's naturally available to someone who pays attention." Robert had built his fortune from a small family business that his grandfather started in 1952. What began as a neighborhood hardware store had grown into Steinberg Holdings, a company worth over $3 billion with interests in real estate, technology, and healthcare. But success hadn't made Robert forget where he came from. His grandfather had taught him that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. Patricia spent the next week gathering information, and what she discovered was remarkable. David Thompson had grown up in the foster care system after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8 years old. He'd moved between 6 different homes before aging out of the system at 18. Despite this difficult start, he'd never been in trouble with the law, had maintained excellent grades throughout high school, and had worked his way into nursing school with a combination of scholarships and part-time jobs. "His academic record is impressive," Patricia reported during their morning meeting. "He's maintaining a 3.8 grade point average while working 2 jobs. His professors describe him as dedicated, intelligent, and naturally compassionate." Robert leaned forward with interest. "What about his work history?" "Both his current employers speak very highly of him. The manager at Morrison's Grocery says David is the most reliable employee he's ever had. He's never called in sick, always volunteers for extra shifts, and customers frequently mention his helpfulness in the store's comment box." Patricia flipped through her notes. "The owner of Tony's Diner has even better things to say. Apparently, David once worked a double shift with food poisoning because they were short-staffed, and he didn't want to leave them in a bind. He regularly stays late to help clean up, even when he's not being paid for the extra time." But what impressed Robert most were the stories about David's character outside of work. Patricia had discovered that David volunteered at Sunset Manor, a senior living center, every Sunday morning. He read to residents who had poor eyesight, helped with recreational activities, and had developed genuine friendships with many of the elderly people there. The activities director at Sunset Manor couldn't say enough good things about him, Patricia continued. She mentioned that David brings his own books sometimes because the center's library is limited. Last month, he spent his own money to buy large print crossword puzzle books for a resident who loves word games. Robert smiled at this detail. It was exactly the kind of small, unnoticed kindness that revealed true character. What about his financial situation? Patricia's expression grew more serious. That's where it gets difficult. He's barely making ends meet. His rent was just increased and he needs expensive textbooks for his final semester. According to his academic advisor, there's concern that he might have to drop out temporarily to work full-time. This information hit Robert harder than he'd expected. Here was a young man who had overcome tremendous obstacles, consistently helped others despite his own struggles, and was on the verge of achieving his dream of becoming a nurse. The irony wasn't lost on Robert that David could lose everything because of money, while Robert had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. There's something else, Patricia added. I spoke with some of his classmates. Apparently, David tutors other students for free during his lunch breaks. Several of them said he's the reason they're passing their classes. And last week, when a classmate's car broke down and she couldn't afford the repair, David gave her his bus money so she could take a taxi to her clinical rotation. Robert stood and walked back to the window. 40 years of business had taught him to be cautious about people's motives. He'd met plenty of individuals who could put on a convincing act of kindness when they wanted something. But David's actions had a consistency that was difficult to fake. More importantly, David had no idea who Robert really was, so there was no reason for him to pretend. Patricia, I want you to verify one more thing for me, Robert said, still looking out at the city. I want to know about his long-term goals. What does he plan to do after he graduates? A few days later, Patricia returned with the answer. David had written an essay for one of his scholarship applications about his dream of working in geriatric nursing. He wanted to specialize in caring for elderly patients, particularly those who didn't have family support. In the essay, he'd written about his experiences in foster care and how it taught him that everyone deserves to feel valued and cared for, regardless of their circumstances. He wrote that he believes healthcare should be about more than just treating medical conditions. Patricia explained, he wants to focus on treating people with dignity and making sure they never feel forgotten or alone. Robert closed his eyes and thought about his own experience that rainy morning. He'd been testing people's reactions, yes, but he'd also genuinely needed help. David's kindness hadn't been performed for an audience. It had been natural, automatic, the kind of goodness that comes from the heart rather than the head. That evening, Robert sat in his study at home, surrounded by the reports Patricia had compiled. David's story was remarkable not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the consistent pattern of his choices. When faced with the decision between helping others and helping himself, David chose others every time. When money was tight and time was precious, he still found ways to make other people's lives a little better. Robert had been searching for something, though he hadn't been entirely sure what it was until now. He'd been looking for proof that genuine goodness still existed in the world, that there were still people who acted with kindness not because it benefited them, but because it was simply the right thing to do. He'd found that proof in a young man who stopped to help a stranger fix his wheelchair, even when he was already late for work. Robert picked up his phone and dialed Patricia's number. I've made a decision, he said when she answered. Set up a meeting with David Thompson. It's time we had a proper conversation. David was restocking the pharmacy section at Morrison's grocery when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, and normally he would have let it go to voicemail during work hours. But something made him step into the break room and answer. Hello, is this David Thompson? The voice belonged to a professional-sounding woman with a warm tone. Yes, this is David. My name is Patricia Williams. I'm calling on behalf of Robert Steinberg. You helped him with his wheelchair a few weeks ago. David's mind went blank for a moment. Robert Steinberg, the elderly man with the simple business card. David had honestly forgotten about their brief encounter, caught up as he was in the daily struggle of work and school. Oh yes, Mr. Steinberg. Is he okay? Did something happen to his wheelchair? Patricia laughed softly. No, nothing like that. He's doing very well. He was wondering if you might be available to meet him for lunch tomorrow. He'd like to thank you properly for your kindness, David. Looked around the cramped break room with its flickering, fluorescent light and wondered why someone would want to meet for lunch over such a small thing. That's really nice of him, but honestly, no thanks are necessary. I was just helping out. He's quite insistent, Patricia said. Would 1 o'clock work for you? At the Meridian downtown? The Meridian. David had walked past that restaurant many times but never been inside. It was the kind of place where people wore suits and ties. where a single meal probably cost more than David spent on groceries in a week. "I'm not sure that's really my kind of place," he said honestly. "Mr. Steinberg specifically requested it. He said to tell you that lunch is completely his treat, and he just wants to have a conversation. Nothing more complicated than that." David hesitated. He had classes until noon the next day, and he usually spent his lunch break studying. But there was something about the woman's tone that made him curious. And honestly, he couldn't remember the last time someone had offered to buy him a meal at a nice restaurant. "Okay," he said finally. 1 o'clock tomorrow? Wonderful. Just give them your name at the front desk and they'll seat you at Mr. Steinberg's table." The next day, David finished his morning classes and took the bus downtown. He'd worn his best shirt and the one pair of dress pants he owned, but he still felt underdressed as he approached the Meridian. The restaurant had floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who nodded politely as David approached. Inside, the atmosphere was even more intimidating. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and every table was set with more silverware than David typically used in a week. The hostess, an elegant woman in a black dress, smiled when he gave his name. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. Right this way." She led him to a corner table where a man in an expensive-looking gray suit was reading a newspaper. When the man looked up, David was shocked to recognize Robert's kind eyes, though everything else about him had changed. Gone were the simple clothes and baseball cap. This version of Robert looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not struggling with a broken wheelchair on a rainy sidewalk. "David," Robert said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you so much for coming." David sat down, feeling completely out of place. The menu didn't have prices listed, which he'd heard was a sign that everything was extremely expensive. "Mr. Steinberg, I have to say, you look very different than when we met." Robert smiled, and suddenly he looked more like the man David remembered. "I imagine I do. I should probably explain that." A waiter appeared immediately, offering water and asking about drinks. Robert ordered a coffee, and David asked for water, not wanting to add to the cost of this already generous meal. "David, what I'm about to tell you might surprise you," Robert said once the waiter had left. "My full name is Robert Steinberg, and I'm the founder and CEO of Steinberg Holdings." The name sounded familiar, but David couldn't place it. "I'm sorry. I'm not really familiar with that company. We own several businesses around the city, real estate, technology companies, healthcare facilities. You might have seen our name on some of the buildings downtown." David tried to process this information. "So you're, what, wealthy?" Robert laughed, a genuine sound that filled the space between them. "Yes, David, very wealthy, which makes what happened that morning even more meaningful to me." "I don't understand," Robert leaned forward slightly. "I occasionally spend time in regular clothes, blending in with everyday people. It helps me understand how people really behave when they don't think there's anything to gain from being kind." David felt a strange mix of confusion and embarrassment. "So you were testing me?" "Not exactly testing, more like observing. And what I observed was a young man who was clearly in a hurry, probably late for work, who stopped to help a stranger without thinking twice about it. No cameras, no audience, no reward expected." The waiter returned to take their order. Robert suggested the salmon, which David accepted, still trying to wrap his head around this conversation. When they were alone again, Robert continued, "After we met, I became curious about you. I had my assistant look into your background, but only information that was naturally available. Your professors, your employers, your volunteer work." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You investigated me? I prefer to think of it as learning about someone who impressed me. And David, what I learned was remarkable. Do you know what your professors say about you? What your coworkers think? What the residents at Sunset Manor feel when you visit them?" David shook his head, unsure where this was going. "They say you're the kind of person who makes everyone around you feel valued. They say you work harder than anyone they know, help others without being asked, and never complain about your circumstances." The food arrived, beautifully presented on white china plates. David took a small bite of the salmon, which was better than anything he'd ever tasted, but his appetite was overwhelmed by confusion. "Mr. Steinberg, I appreciate the kind words, but I don't understand why you're telling me this." Robert set down his fork and looked directly at David. "Because I want to offer you something. I'm starting a charitable foundation focused on healthcare and education. I need someone to help run it, someone who understands what it means to struggle, someone who genuinely cares about helping others. David blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a full scholarship for your final semester, plus a guaranteed position as program coordinator when you graduate. The salary would be $85,000 a year to start, with full benefits and opportunities for advancement. The number hit David like a physical blow. $85,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined earning, especially right out of school. I don't know what to say. The foundation would focus on helping students like yourself, people who have the talent and drive to succeed but face financial barriers. You'd help design scholarship programs, work with schools to identify deserving students, and oversee the distribution of grants. David's mind was racing. This was the kind of opportunity that could change everything, not just for him but for other people struggling the way he had been struggling. But it also seemed too good to be true. Why me? You could hire someone with more experience, someone who's already proven themselves in this kind of work. Robert smiled again. Experience can be taught, David. Character cannot. And in 40 years of business, I've learned that character is what matters most. David looked around the elegant restaurant, then back at Robert. This is real? You're serious about this offer? Completely serious. But I don't want you to answer right now. Take time to think about it. Have a lawyer look at the contract. Make sure this is what you want. Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Here's everything in writing. The scholarship details, the job description, the salary and benefits. Take it home, study it, ask questions. David accepted the folder with shaking hands. Mr. Steinberg, I need to ask you something. That morning when I helped you, were you really stuck or was that part of the test? I was genuinely stuck, Robert said without hesitation. The wheelchair problem was real. Your choice to help was real. And David, that choice is about to change your life. David spent 3 sleepless nights reading through the contract Robert had given him. He'd taken it to the free legal clinic at the community college, where a volunteer lawyer confirmed that everything was legitimate and incredibly generous. The scholarship would cover his remaining tuition and textbooks. The job offer included health insurance, retirement benefits, and vacation time. It was more than David had dared to dream about even in his most optimistic moments. But doubt crept in during the quiet hours. Why would someone choose him over candidates with business degrees or nonprofit experience? What if he wasn't smart enough for this kind of responsibility? What if Robert discovered he'd made a mistake? On Thursday morning, David called the number Patricia had given him. I'd like to accept Mr. Steinberg's offer, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. That's wonderful news, Patricia replied. Robert will be so pleased. Can you start part-time next week while you finish your semester? He's eager to show you how the foundation works. David's first day at Steinberg Holdings was overwhelming in the best possible way. The building was 48 floors of glass and steel, with views that stretched to the horizon. Patricia met him in the lobby and handed him a temporary security badge with his photo and the title Program Coordinator, Steinberg Foundation. Robert's office was nothing like David had imagined. Yes, it was large and impressive, but it was also filled with family photos, books, and comfortable furniture that invited conversation rather than intimidation. Robert greeted David with the same warm handshake he remembered from that rainy morning. Ready to change some lives? Robert asked with a grin. The foundation was still in its early stages, which meant David would help build it from the ground up. Robert had already identified the mission, providing scholarships and support to students pursuing healthcare careers who faced financial hardships. David's job was to help design the application process, establish partnerships with nursing schools and medical programs, and create mentorship opportunities. I want you to think about what you needed when you were struggling, Robert explained during their first working meeting. What would have made the biggest difference in your life? That's what we'll provide for others. David threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. He developed application forms that looked beyond just grades and test scores, including questions about personal challenges and community service. He reached out to nursing schools across the state, explaining the foundation's mission and asking them to identify deserving students. His first major project was visiting Sunset Manor, the senior center where he volunteered, to present the foundation's first scholarship award. Mrs. Johnson, the activities director, had mentioned that one of the nursing assistants there was trying to go back to school to become a registered nurse but couldn't afford the program. Lisa, Chen was a single mother working double shifts to support her 2 young children. When David sat down with her to explain the scholarship, her eyes filled with tears. "This can't be real," she whispered. "I've been saving for 3 years and still don't have enough for even one semester." "It's completely real," David assured her. "The foundation will cover your tuition, textbooks, and even provide a monthly stipend for living expenses while you're in school." 2 months later, David attended his own graduation ceremony. He'd finished his nursing degree with honors, and Robert and Patricia were in the audience beaming like proud family members. When David's name was called for the Dean's List recognition, Robert stood and applauded so enthusiastically that other people started clapping, just because of his infectious excitement. After the ceremony, David found Robert in the crowd of families and graduates. "I have something for you," Robert said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small wrapped box. A graduation gift. Inside was a simple silver pen engraved with David's name and the date. "For signing all the scholarship letters you're going to write," Robert explained. David felt overwhelmed by the gesture. In all his years bouncing between foster homes, no one had ever given him a graduation gift. "Mr. Steinberg, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "You thank me by helping others the way you've always done," Robert replied. "And David? You can call me Robert now. We're partners in this work." As summer progressed, the foundation grew rapidly. David had identified 12 students for the first round of scholarships, including Lisa from Sunset Manor, a veteran returning to school after being injured overseas, and a teenager who'd aged out of foster care just like David had. Each story was different, but they all shared common elements: determination, kindness, and financial barriers that seemed impossible to overcome. David's favorite part of the job was the mentorship program he'd developed. Each scholarship recipient was paired with a working healthcare professional who could provide guidance and support. David often served as a mentor himself, meeting with students over coffee to discuss their challenges and celebrate their successes. One evening, as David was reviewing applications in his new office, Patricia knocked on his door. "There's someone here to see you," she said with a mysterious smile. David looked up to see Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman he'd helped with groceries at Morrison's months earlier. She was carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. "I heard about your new job," she said, setting the plate on his desk. "I made your favorite cookies." David was confused. "How did you know where to find me?" Mrs. Garcia's eyes twinkled. "My grandson works in the building. He told me about the young man who was starting a foundation to help nursing students. When he described you, I knew it had to be the same sweet boy who helped me at the grocery store." As Mrs. Garcia shared her cookies and told David about her grandson's progress in college, David realized something profound. The kindness he'd shown to others over the years wasn't disappearing into a void. It was creating connections, building relationships, and somehow finding its way back to him in unexpected ways. A year later, the Steinberg Foundation had awarded scholarships to over 50 students across 3 states. David had been promoted to executive director, and the foundation was receiving recognition from healthcare organizations nationwide. But the moment that mattered most to David came on a Tuesday morning when he received a letter from their very first scholarship recipient, Lisa. Chen had graduated from nursing school with top honors and was now working in the pediatric wing of Children's Hospital. She wrote, "Because of the foundation's support, I was able to focus on my studies instead of worrying about money. But more than that, I learned something important from David's example. He showed me that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself, but about how you lift others up along the way." That afternoon, David was walking past the same bus stop where he'd first met Robert when his phone rang. It was a nursing student from across the country who'd heard about the foundation and wanted to apply for next year's scholarships. As David talked with the young man about his dreams of becoming a nurse and his struggles to afford school, he found himself thinking about that rainy morning that had changed everything. He still carried Robert's original business card in his wallet, though it was worn and faded now. It reminded him that you never know when a simple act of kindness might change your life, or when you might have the chance to change someone else's. Robert often said that the foundation's success wasn't measured in dollars awarded or students graduated, but in the ripple effect of kindness it created. Each scholarship recipient went on to help others, who would help others, creating an endless chain of compassion that started with one young man who stopped to help a stranger fix his wheelchair. 5 years later, David still sometimes thought about what would have happened if he'd kept walking that morning, if he'd been too focused on his own problems to notice someone else in need. The foundation now operated in 12 states and had helped over 500 students pursue healthcare careers. But David knew that all of it traced back to a simple choice he'd made on a sidewalk, when helping someone else seemed more important than being on time. Some mornings, when the foundation's work felt overwhelming, David would remember his grandmother's words about kindness coming back when you least expect it. She'd been right, though she probably never imagined just how dramatically that kindness would return, or how many other lives it would touch along the way.